Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit this morning about how I came to writing Monumental. And the story of Monumental is largely the story of Oscar James Dunn. And the reason we call him a forgotten hero is for much of my life and for much of history, he has largely been written out. He's been scratched from the record. And to really sort of explore him again and to get to know him required a lot of primary source research, which meant lots of reading newspapers, lots of going to the archives, lots of exploring documents that hadn't been looked at in many, many years. So, saying this, I want to ask a question. When did you fall in love with history? I mean, everybody in here is a history practitioner. So there's probably some significant event, some significant book, some visit to a museum, some teacher that influenced you to a point where you fell in love with history. Raise your hands if you know the exact moment you fell in love with history. Okay, I'll start over here.
It was I want to say my sophomore professor, Dr. St. Julian. She was my history professor, and she just made history fun, relevant, and real human.
Okay. Very good. I like that idea. She made it fun. She made it connected with really human. Ma'am.
I think it was between my 8th grade history teacher of Louisiana History and my History 301 professor at McNeese. My History 301 professor at McNeese was outstanding. I mean, he was just all over the place. He was in the back room, he just walked and talked and tried to act out whatever he could. He was just really good. So, it was interesting.
All right, let me see those hands again. I know a couple right over here.
I probably was about 6.
Okay.
And we were touring Myrtle's plantation. And my aunt, who is a history buff, just opened my eyes to all of these things that you could see. And she's still my partner in crime when it comes to history stuff and walking through museums and reading everything in a museum. And she just taught me to love history like she did.
Excellent. Anybody else that wants to share their experience?
When I first took Louisiana History.
First, Louisiana History is where you fell in love? Oh. Louisiana History, how about over there?
Mine came way later in life, in my adult life, because in high school, they were very surface. I was just telling my friend after being here, I was like, they didn't teach us like this when I was in high school. They taught us for history, it was just very, like we talked about the presidents, and it was just very surface. They didn't go into slavery and all of this stuff. So my love of history now, it came in my adult life. And once I went to college, and they went deeper. And so it opened me up to wanting to know more. So it came later in life, and I'm falling in love with it. You're in a romance right now. Yeah. You're dating phase with history. I like that. All right. I remember the exact moment I fell in love with history, or should I say the exact school year I fell in love with history. It was 1976. The bicentennial year, and I just returned back to the city of New Orleans from Chicago, where I'd been living since I was 2 years old. My mother was staying behind because she was completing her studies, and I had to go stay with family. And every day after school, I would go to my great-grandmother's house. My great-grandmother was interesting. Her name was Maddie Jackson Dunn. She was quite interesting. She was born in 1893, I believe, in East Feliciana. She was the granddaughter of a plantation owner, and she grew up on a large estate, which is
unusual for an African American. They had mills, they had grist mills and lumber mills and all sorts of things going on the estate. And quite often when we think of like things like sharecropping, we think of oppressive systems that are put in place by and controlled by white men. Her father had a plantation that had sharecroppers, and he was a black man. So that's very, a different sort of scenario. And she didn't watch television. So when I come home from school, there wasn't much to do. In fact, all I would do is go through photo albums and go through scrapbooks and ask her questions, maybe listen to her play the piano, and that's about it. But I love doing that. I love doing that. It's during this time that I first came to understand who Oscar James Dunn was and who my connection and what was my connection to this individual. While going through one of her scrapbooks, I came across this article. March 13th, 1872, the National Republican. He was to them, and them being black Americans, their great preservative, their leader, the embodiment of their hopes, the real Moses who, as they fainted and famished in the struggle to reach the goal of acknowledged manhood, smote the rock of adversity till it gushed forth the cheering waters of hope. It was Oscar James Dunn who led his people from the land of oppression and bondage. I was like, wow. And the thing that captured my attention in this was that his last name was the same as my grandmother. So I'm asking my grandmother, who's this guy and why is he famous? Who is this guy? And he's got your same last name. Are we related to him? And she says, yes. She says, that's your great uncle. Your grandfather Emmanuel, and my grandfather Emmanuel died the year I was born. She said, well, that was his great uncle. And I was like, okay, why is he famous? She went on to explain his historical significance to me, but then added on family stories. These family stories to me at that point were just lore. Little kids are given information and they take it and they hold it close to them. But this will be very, very important later on when it came to researching these things, because there was very little written about Dunn. In 1976, being the bicentennial year, people were talking about government all the time. We're coming up on the 250th, and we're already planning for the 250th in museums around the country right now. At that time, in second grade, they were asking us to discuss what government meant to us and who our leaders were now versus who our leaders were, who the founding fathers were. And in the classroom, I was asked to raise my hand if I knew any other leaders in our state. If you knew a governor or lieutenant governor, please raise your hand. And I raised my hand and I shook it. You know how kids are, especially in second grade. They're enthusiastic about everything. Shook it violently. The teacher called on me and I said, Oscar James Dunn. And she said, who is Oscar James Dunn? And I said, well, he was the first African-American governor of the state of Louisiana. And she said, no, you must be mistaken. There's never been a black governor of the state of Louisiana. And I shook my hand again, and I said, no, you're wrong. There have been 3 black lieutenant governors of the state of Louisiana. And then I went on to name them in order as my great-grandmother had taught me. Oscar Dunn, PBS Pinchback, and Salazar, Antoine. And the teacher became enraged. She sent me to the office. My classmates made fun of me. And I went home in tears.
But you were correct. But you were correct.
Well, I went home and I said, Grandma, you know, what happened? You told me that this was true. And she said, it is. And I said, well, why doesn't anyone know who he is? And she said, they forgot him. And that began my quest to sort of explore the life of Oscar James Dunn, to restore him rightfully to the place that he belongs historically, and to define what Reconstruction meant and the achievements therein. Yesterday, we were lucky enough to have Mr. Mark Rudnay here. And one of the things that he pointed to as his very favorite book and the thing that changed his life, did anybody pick up what it was? He mentioned it a couple times. Black Reconstruction. Does anybody know the significance of that?
Is that the Douglas book?
That's a W.B. Du Bois book.
Oh, yeah.
That book is the book that started the revisionist history movement. In a historical context, extremely significant, because just as the Lost Cause that we talked about yesterday with Pollard wrote history, the correcting of that history began with Du Bois's Black Reconstruction. So what did I learn about Dunn as I began studying Dunn? One of the things that had been a mystery was where Dunn came from, when he was born. There were no records of this because most people realized that he was born enslaved. I was able to find purchase documents which trace back to his original owner, the person who had owned him at the time that he was born and had owned his mother. A cotton factor by the name of George P. Bowers. Bowers was a merchant that lived in the Vieux Carré, so he lived in the French Quarter. And the records substantiated Dunn being born in 1822, likely born in one of the houses in the French Quarter, and I know which house. So, yeah, the address is still there, and there's still a building there. I doubt if it's the same building because New Orleans, the French Quarter, has gone through a number of significant fires. The next big achievement is to figure out how he becomes free. And we do know how Oscar Dunn becomes free. He is manumitted by his stepfather, a man by the name of James Dunn. And those of you who might be asking the question, how do they have the same name if, it's his stepfather? Well, slaves in New Orleans didn't have last names. So while he was enslaved, his name was Oscar. That's it. Oscar. You have no last name. When you're manumitted, however, you can take on a last name. And he was so in love with his stepfather. And his stepfather did this fantastic thing for him that would change his life. He adopts his stepfather's entire name, incorporating that into his own, becoming Oscar James Dunn. We know that his family was freed in 1832, and we know that he was freed not for labor purposes. It wasn't purchased and used as a slave, because his father, within a year, had gone, as soon as he could raise the money, had gone before the police jury and freed the entire family. So it was Dunn, his mother, and at that point, a sister by the name of Jane. A huge revelation was made when I discovered an obituary. And there's a lot that you can learn from an obituary. Can you guys give me some ideas of things you can learn from an obituary when you read an obituary?
Parents, children,
Again, family, children, spouse, occupations, achievements.
education.
Now, how important is it that the person who knows you is writing the obituary? Yeah.
Very.
As with famous people, there were numerous obituaries written of Oscar James Dunn. However, most of the obituaries that had gained any traction were those written by white men. So the obituary that becomes popular in his absence after he dies was written by a former employer that he had an argument with, and that he ends up walking off the job. If you were going to have somebody write your obituary, a guy that you walked off the job from probably shouldn't be the one writing your obituary. However, there was an extremely short-run newspaper that Oscar James Dunn himself had been a part of. He's not a writer of it, but it was known as his paper. It was called the Civic Guard. And in the Civic Guard, I found an obituary that was written by a Masonic brother of his who had known him since he was a child. He was older than Dunn and had been a lifelong friend. And this was extremely telling because it confirmed lots of things my grandmother had told me about Dunn's life. Good and controversial. So one of the first things that it confirmed is that despite the fact that Dryden, his old boss, maintained that he wasn't ever formally trained, that he learned to read and write from actors that stayed at his parents' boarding house, Parsons says no. His father sent him to a school, just like the Covent school. And it was a boarding house. And he stayed there and he studied there until he was the age of 14 or 15, 14 years old. And then he was apprenticed to a plasterer because you need a trade where you can make money. So he becomes a plasterer. We know exactly who he studied under to become a plasterer. It was listed in the article. So I thought that was fantastic, finding this article. And the reason that was so rare, the circulation for the Civic Guard was only 500 copies. So every printing was only 500 copies, and that's the only known surviving copy of the day after he passed away. So there's just one copy. The Civic Guard, and it changed its name that year to the National Republican, the New Orleans National Republican. We know that and we talked a little bit about Dryden, as he worked as a plasterer, he decided he didn't like it. In fact, according to his friend Parsons, what he had an affinity for was learning. He loved reading books, and he wanted a job where he could sit back and read all day. George Cable, the famous writer, will model a character in one of his books after Dunn, and making him a black bookstore owner who just read books and sold books from the bookstore all day long. But he has a passion for this type of work, and what he does hate is working hard. And this is something he shared with Abraham Lincoln. You know, why work hard when I can work smart? This advertisement talks about the time that he absconds from this detail that he's working. And he absconds from this detail. There aren't any particulars, but if we look at what's going on in New Orleans in that year, there is a lot of unrest around race, not just black and white, but between also Afro-Creoles and Anglo-Africans. So Afro-Creoles are people who come from the region, speak French or Spanish, are generally Catholic, and they are separate from those blacks that are coming from English-speaking Protestant colonies. So they're seeing each other as competing factions in the city. They're competing for jobs, they're competing for resources, they're competing for space. Dunn does learn something from Dryden, and we do know a little bit about their relationship. Dryden, at some point in his life, much earlier than when he becomes a contractor, had been a singer. And Dunn loves music. So Dryden would sing on the job. And Dunn wanted to learn music from him. So his first music teacher is Dryden. But once he learns everything he possibly can learn from Dryden, he leaves Dryden and goes and begins studying under a Spanish guitar master by the name of Torna. Torna teaches him not only to play the guitar, but this gives him another pathway to make money. Dunn quits his work and begins teaching guitar lessons to families, wealthy families, who are willing to allow their sons and daughters to be taught by him. In 1860, an incident happens that will ruin this second profession for Dunn. The incident occurs when another musician, who is a free man of color by the name of Martin, is found to have been having affairs with young ladies that he was teaching. Martin's figured out when an elderly actress by the name of Thayer, I believe her name was Frances Thayer, or Fanny Thayer, goes to his house. And she goes to his house because her daughter had run away and had been staying with Martin for months. She didn't want to tell anybody initially out of the embarrassment that this black man had taken her daughter away. But eventually she gets the courage to go to the police, and now with the police officer, they go to his home. She knocks on his home, the door opens, and her daughter's there. But she's not alone. She's got a brand new baby. Huge scandal breaks in New Orleans newspapers as the story begins to escalate. It's not that he's just sleeping with her daughter, but several of the other pupils. Several of the other pupils. And one of the things that's really, really interesting about history and being able to look back at records, they didn't name the girls, not entirely. They gave their initials in the street they lived on. So you can go to the census records and figure out which of the girls were in illicit contact with Martin. Well, this ruins it for Dunn. Martin actually was being housed. There was a small containment jail in Gravier Hall, which is just a few blocks away from where we're at today. A large crowd gathered in that park in Lafayette Square, demanding that he be tarred and feathered. The police will come out, the sheriff, and fire into the air, running off the crowd. And surprisingly, Martin isn't lynched. He goes to prison. He survives. He goes to prison. But this is enough to shake Dunn up, to realize, I can't be a musician anymore. There's way too much scrutiny. And to make matters worse, the article maintained that he had two friends that were engaging in the same conduct, that were musicians that were not caught. So it totally ruins it for Dunn.
You be with your boy.
Wasn't that your friend? No, not my friend. I don't know him. So Dunn, once again, finds himself falling back on being a plasterer. You have to remember that this is just before the war. Just before the war. Then a niche opens up for him. That niche that opens up for him is only available to him because he can read and write. As enslaved people are running away from plantations, plantation owners are now looking for labor to try to work those plantations. The Union forces come in and take the city, the surrounding areas, and they want to keep the production going of foodstuff and of cotton. And to do this, they need what? Workers. So Dunn opens an intelligence office. And people ask me, what's an intelligence office? Think of it as a temporary job service. And he begins writing contracts to the formerly enslaved to get them to go back to the plantations. And in it, it defines what their wages are, what their benefits are. And in many of them, they even define that schools should be built and time should be given to them to take off for church. Dunn becomes wealthy, extremely wealthy. He doesn't just do this in Louisiana. After the war, he will run his business also in Mississippi. And he will place thousands of individuals. His influence, when we talk about Dunn's influence.
Question.
Yes.
You say that he ran away. Well, that he was a runaway.
When you are contracted to someone, you're obliged to work there until you have completed the project. When he got in an argument, he was like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Deuces. And then he hit the road. So they put these articles out for his arrest. And this will be mistaken decades later as what? The fact that this would say that would be proof that others will use to say, well, he was enslaved. Yes, he was enslaved, but we know exactly when he was released. We know exactly why they're hunting him down.
He was tall.
Yeah, he was a tall guy for the time. Didn't get that height, sorry. Yesterday I discussed his political career and his entry into it. We say that he owes a great deal to two factors. One, he was seen as a leader within the AME church. He isn't a minister, but he is a deacon at the church, and he's seen as a leader in that church. The largest AME church in the South is St. James AME. It was
That's my church.
That's your church? It was one of the churches that I hoped that we would have stopped at, because their stained glass window has lots and lots of Masonic references within it. And the Masons are pivotal in the foundation of that church. So when that church is built in the 1840s, Dunn and Dunn's friends are pivotal to raising the funds to build that church. In most of the southern states, the AME church is forbidden. So when I say that there is an AME church in New Orleans and it has 4,000 members at that time, that is a massive church.
Okay.
Did we pass
What? Okay. So
No, that was a place that I hoped that was on the tour, but it wasn't.
What kind of church?
St. James AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Okay, that was what I didn't understand your abbreviation.
Yeah, African Methodist Episcopal is what AME stands for. Outside of being a functionary partner inside of the AME church, he is also the leader of the Black Masons in the state, so the Prince Hall Masons. He is their Grand Master. And there's a third factor that will make him very, very appealing. Where many of the free blacks in the city had been born free, Dunn had been born in bondage. So he has a common factor that he can share with all of the enslaved people in the state. And there are far more enslaved people than there were people who were born free. His work with the Freedmen's Bureau, his work as an intelligence officer, also placed him in good contact with the recently emancipated. He was able to develop trust with them, kinship, and they saw him as a true leader. The very first office that he held, we talked about yesterday, and it was on the junior board of assistants for the aldermen. And he is pointed to this position by then Major General Sheridan. He will also hold a position of the assistant to the recorder. And recorders were, the city was divided into districts, and each district was headed by a recorder. So in those districts, the recorder acted quite literally as a miniature mayor and a miniature judge. There was a recorder's court, and you could be called to recorder's court. And Dunn will serve as the assistant recorder to the city's 2nd district. In that capacity, he will be called to be the first black judge to serve a sentence on white men. And the transcripts or the accounts of that case, that very first case, are hilarious, because it's a white man by the name of Smith that is the plaintiff. There's another man a white man who is the defendant. There is, for the very first time in Louisiana history, a black judge presiding over the court. And both the defendant and the plaintiff say, well, look, I can't have a black judge. And he's like, you're not recognized by any of the state laws. Keep in mind, the 14th Amendment hadn't been passed yet. So both the plaintiff's attorney and the defendant's attorney are held in contempt of court and charged fines by Dunn until they relent to accept his authority. So fantastic. And finally, in July of 1868, he becomes the nation's first black executive officer when he is elected to the 2nd highest post in the state and becomes the lieutenant governor, the first black lieutenant governor of Louisiana. The man that we're looking at is Henry Clay Warmoth, and he was governor. He was the governor to Oscar James Dunn. Dunn will have one lamentation, and we talked about this yesterday in his life, one regret. And his regret is that he had brought Henry Clay Warmoth before the Friends of Universal Suffrage and had told the members that he was a person that they could trust. The Friends of Universal Suffrage, when they registered blacks, believed that they could get more clout for African Americans if Henry Clay Warmoth, a former colonel in the Union forces, delivered those registration books to Washington, D.C. personally. He's rewarded by the Friends of Universal Suffrage for his apparent loyalty. And he becomes the youngest man to ever be elected governor of the state of Louisiana. In fact, they have to change the Constitution. In the 1868 Constitution, they literally have to lower the age so that he can become lieutenant governor. So when Dunn and the rest of the free black men proposed a Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Civil Rights Act had been written in 1866, but it was proposed in the 1868 legislature. When they bring this to him, he vetoes it. The one time, the very first time that black people actually need something from him, after they have elevated him to this point, he vetoes it. And he says something that's very, very familiar in African American history. Just don't think you guys are ready for it. I think we should go slow. And it's something, that's a phrase I tell my students all the time. Whenever I hear go slow, there's a sort of primal rage that I get, because it's universally something that's told to African Americans throughout our history in regard to progress. Oh, you're going too fast. You need to slow down. Dunn will sever ties with Warmoth. So the governor and the lieutenant governor, despite being the same party, cease working together and began working in opposition of each other. The free blacks that are radical, people like Rudnez and Trevine, will all join sides with Dunn and fight actively against the sitting governor. They will ultimately try to impeach him in 1870. And right before the impeachment trial, Dunn will mysteriously fall dead. He will go to a banquet. A rumor will circulate that he was dosed or poisoned at the banquet. And the next evening, he will fall deathly ill. He will die in one day, a day and a half. He only lasts.
What day was that?
November 24th.
1871?
1871 is when he dies. Isn't that like, it's an intriguing story. The reason it's intriguing to me is it's an African-American man who was on his way to being the governor of the state. Not only was he on his way to being the governor of the state, when I started going through the Ulysses S. Grant letter books, I found letters that Grant was circulating with other white leaders in the Republican Party. And they were saying, if Dunn can do this, maybe this is the man we need as vice president. Maybe if we put him in as vice president, he can carry the black vote in the South. So potentially, I hate to talk about counterfactuals.
I have a question for you. I hope this doesn't sound crazy, but like, how do you think Dunn was able to get elected as lieutenant governor with so many racist white people in Louisiana?
They weren't allowed to vote yet. They hadn't made the oath. In fact, when we talked about the 14th Amendment and how it gets ratified, Dunn, and this is to show you how shrewd Dunn and some of the black politicians were. Even though there's no requirement to have an ironclad oath. And what the ironclad oath meant was when you came up to take your oath to be sworn in as a senator, you also had to swear before the whole body that you wouldn't take part in a confederacy again, a rebellion again, and that you denounce the Confederacy. What do you think all the Democrats who were there did? They didn't want to embarrass themselves, and they didn't know how the other people were, so a lot of them did what? They refused to swear it in. Well, because they never swore the oath of service, they weren't part of the body, so he didn't need to count them for quorum. So he had the vote for the 14th Amendment when all of these men who were Democrats said, no, we're not going to swear the oath. And that's how they were able to pass the 14th Amendment in the state. So he was really, really shrewd. But he was really, really fair. He took a trip to Washington, D.C. in 1869 to visit Ulysses S. Grant immediately following his inauguration. And it was really the first sort of national trip that will shed light on travel accommodations for blacks. You have to keep in mind, he's a lieutenant governor of the state. And at that time, the train company, the Great Northern Railroad, gave passes to senators so they could travel to New Orleans and back to their home parishes for free. But that year, they didn't give any passes to all the black delegates who were there. So Dunn is traveling with a white delegate by the name of Lynch, who is going up to get married. And Dunn goes to the Great Northern Railroad. You know who's the president of the Great Northern Railroad? No, probably not. Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard is the president of the railroad. So he shows up in Beauregard's office. Now, why is Beauregard important in this concept?
Because he was one of the major generals in the Civil War.
He was, even before the Civil War started, he was the greatest artillery officer in U.S. service. Right. The funny thing about the Battle of Fort Sumter, it pitted Beauregard against his instructor. It was inside when he went to West Point, he was the only person in West Point up until that time that didn't get a direct command to go out in the field. When he graduated, he was such a good artillery officer that they kept him there as an instructor. And that was his appointment, to teach people how to use artillery. He is the person that fired the first shot of the Civil War. So Dunn shows up in his office and says, look, I'd like to buy a first-class ticket. I've got plenty of money. And the white guy who's with him says, you know, by the way, you gave us first class tickets. You didn't give them to many black people, so I'd like to return mine. And Beauregard's slick too. Beauregard says, well, you know, the company of the policy is not to let blacks ride with white women and gentlemen. But you can always petition the board. They meet in a week. Of course, they wanted the tickets for tomorrow, so they can't meet with the board. So Dunn says, well, I will purchase a first class ticket. And he says, well, we can't allow you to sit in the car. So he says he purchases a first class ticket, but he had to sit in what was called the Negro car. And there are no sleeping accommodations, so you have to sit up all night. It's like when you get on budget, like I take the train Amtrak every once in a while, and you have to sit up all day if you don't get a sleeping car. So he does that. And he has to sit up all the way from Louisiana to Kentucky. And it isn't until Kentucky when his first class ticket is honored. In fact, when he gets off in Kentucky, to cross the river to go in Ohio, he wants to get on an omnibus. And an omnibus is a precursor to the modern bus. It's just a large carriage drawn by horses. And he's told, you have to ride on the top of the car. You can't sit in the car with white women and gentlemen. And it was called the Negro seat, and not such a nice word, on the top. And he says no. He's like, I'm not doing that. So he rents his own carriage, and it rides him into Ohio, where he can actually board this first class train. Everywhere he went, and he goes on a national tour. This is the first black political junket in American history. He goes on a national tour. He goes to Washington, D.C., he goes to Boston. When he goes to Washington, D.C., if any of you have been there, right across from the White House is a hotel called the Willard. The Willard's still open. It's a beautiful hotel. He has people call ahead, and they say the Lieutenant Governor of Louisiana would like a room in the Willard. And the Willard says, well, he can sign our registrar, but he can't stay in the hotel. He goes to New York, and he stays in another hotel called the Metropolitan. And he's told that he could rent a room in the hotel, but he couldn't occupy the room. He had to sleep in the basement with the valets and the servants that worked in the hotel. And he calls on the mayor of New York, largely because the mayor of New York had grown up in the city of New Orleans. And he asked him, why don't you come down, we can have lunch, and we can talk. The mayor will write him back. You know, if you ever correspond with me again on a personal level, I'll have you thrown out of the hotel. This is the lieutenant governor of a state. He will visit the stock exchange, New York Stock Exchange, and a prank on a major level will be played on him. The stock exchange, the guys, there were a lot of young stock exchange workers who decide to play a prank on the newspapers. So they go around the corner to a black barber shop, and they get a black barber to pretend to be Dunn and show up at the New York Stock Exchange and say, hi, I'm the governor of Louisiana. And they take this guy on a tour, and of course the press is asking him all sorts of questions. And he has no idea about anything in Louisiana. He's never been there. He's a barber that they have positioned to appear to be the governor of the state. So this trip, even though he does personally meet Ulysses S. Grant, he talks to Sumner, he is honored on the floor of the Senate, is heralded as a success by some, but by the free blacks in the city of New Orleans, this was a huge insult. And it just shed light that there was just as much discrimination in the North as there was in the South.
And sometimes in the North more.
Okay. This these are pages that appear in the graphic history. And this is an image of Dunn and Henry Clay Warmoth. And this is Dunn in his private audience with Ulysses S. Grant. One of the things that Dunn begs Grant to do is to replace, they had sent away Sheridan, Philip Sheridan. The whites in the city of New Orleans were really, really upset that he put black people in political positions. And Dunn goes there really to appeal to Ulysses S. Grant to ask him to send Philip Sheridan back. He said, we trust Philip Sheridan. Philip Sheridan was fair. Could you send him back to the city of New Orleans?
Okay, was it 1868 he went to DC?
1869.
69, okay.
In the spring of 1860, he'll go to Washington, D.C. twice in his life before he dies. He'll go in 1870 also. Okay. Dunn's funeral was held, so he died on the 22nd, not the 24th. Dunn's funeral was held on November 23rd, 1871. It's the first time an African American was given such an honor for holding a political position. It was declared a day of mourning throughout the city. All city offices closed, so all business offices closed in the city. Democrats and Republicans alike flooded the streets. And the procession that followed, and I wish we had stopped at where his home was too, because his home no longer is there. He intentionally built a home on Canal Street. And Canal Street is the traditional dividing point for the city, right? It's where a lot of battles were taking place. It is a division between the French speakers and the Americans. So this was a very symbolic move for him to build this, to purchase this house that was on Canal Street. He is held in wake. His wake is within his home, and visitors will visit his home. Down the street from that is AME Church. The AME Church, St. James AME, is 3-4 blocks away from his home on Canal Street. And there will be a funeral for him at St. James AME. And then there is a funeral procession. And the funeral procession is the likes of which the city hadn't seen up until that point. By some estimates, there are as many as 50,000 people that go to his funeral. The funeral will go from Canal, from AME Church, swing all the way down to the foot of the river, and then go all the way up to the cemetery that we visited. And by the time the first hearse with his body reaches the cemetery, there's still people leaving his home. So it's tens of thousands of people flood the streets. When we talk about the importance of Dunn, this is one example of how important he was nationally. And this isn't a New Orleans newspaper. This is the New National Era. It's a Republican newspaper out of Washington, D.C. Gifted with remarkably sound judgment, there was no man in Louisiana whose opinion and counsel upon the questions of state were more often sought by honest men of both parties. His parliamentary talents has long been the theme of admiration, and for the dispatch of business in official chair, few men in the Union have been his equal. And I kind of wish Mark was here today, because this quote comes directly from the book he maintains changed his life. And it's a quote that I use in my dissertation. With sufficient agreement and determination among the dominant classes, the truth of history may be utterly distorted and contradicted, and change to any convenient fairy tale that the masters of men wish. W.E. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction, 1935. People didn't immediately forget Oscar James Dunn. The very same year that we're having the Colfax Massacre, the very same time that we're having the Coshota Massacre, at the very same time the Battle of Liberty Place is raging, the legislature is making attempts to honor Dunn and to remember his life. Act 57 called for the design and the completion of a monument to honor Dunn. You can see the men who are on the committee. C.C. Antoine would become a lieutenant governor. Packard was Ulysses S. Grant's brother-in-law. Paul Trevine was the noted writer who wrote for the Tribune. Mary Aristide, he was and B.F. Joubert. His name is Blanc. Blanc Joubert, there's a fantastic story about Blanc Joubert. Blanc Joubert was one of the richest black men in the city, and they were trying to integrate the Catholic school system. And as soon as the National Civil Rights Bill passes, Blanc Joubert gets together with a group of other black men. He says, well, I'm going to try to enroll my daughter into Sacred Heart, Sacré-Cœur on St. Charles, which is the most elite girls' school here. So he shows up at Sacré-Cœur, and he said, I would like to enroll my daughter. And they initially think the money would be an obstacle. So they told him, you know, it's really too expensive for you to put your daughter in the school. You don't have that kind of money. To which he pulled out a big satchel filled with gold and just poured it out on the table. And the Catholic Church responded by saying, well, we don't admit girls. And he pointed to the Civil Rights Act that had just been passed that we talked about with Lyman Trumbull. And they decide, well, we're going to just close the school. And so they close the school. They closed the school. One of the reasons that we have as many parochial schools as we do is Oscar Dunn in 1870 will integrate public education. I know we hear a lot about Ruby Bridges, but Oscar Dunn, after the fall break, so in December of 1870, he and his wife will make a decision. They had put his entire fortune went into building orphanages and schools for black people. But he realized, if I'm going to make the city better, what I have to do is not focus on adults today. He's like, I can't change adults' minds. What I have to focus on are children, and getting them in close contact with each other, getting them to work together and develop mutual respect for one another. He knew that black families wouldn't trust this. You know, why would I send my child to a school where people have been beating and killing us for a century or more here? So he knew that he would have to be the first person to do this. He had no children of his own. He married a woman that had 3 children. He adopted all 3. And his 2 daughters become the first 2 children to integrate the schools. And that's important because everybody begins to follow suit. However, it didn't get the response he thought it would get. He thought people would, okay, well, we have no choice. The law says this. What they begin doing is closing down schools, and the Catholic Church begins opening schools, and then they flood into private schools. And that's the story of New Orleans. The monument that was proposed by Act 57 was never built for the reasons that we discussed yesterday. Largely, the Republicans had lost their will to commit themselves to African Americans and commit themselves to this long-term process of Reconstruction. That's the cover of Monumental. And these are some of my favorite pages. One of the things that most historians have liked about it is it uses a lot of historical endnotes. So if you really wanted to track any of the things that I write about, any of the things I say, they're all cited, and you can always go back to these newspapers or go back to these sources and find out exactly what those sources say. There are maps, and if you look at the map, you'll see that some of them are colored and some of them are not. I use color coding to indicate which sites are still there that you can visit and which sites are no longer there. So you don't have to waste your time going to places and there's nothing there but a lot. There are actually, buildings that are there, that were there at the time of Dunn's term in office. And there are also timelines. And these timelines let you follow what's going on in Dunn's life. There's a glossary of difficult terms, and the reason I put that in is while people in Louisiana might know those terms, the chances that some kid in Ohio or a group of kids in San Francisco or Seattle would know these terms is very, very unlikely. And I realize that different schools have different target groups and different demographics also. So while some people that grew up in Afro-Creole community might be very, very familiar with some of the terms, people outside of that community might not. And I've gone around the country to many schools. In fact, I guess the weirdest situation I've had was there was a school, an immersion school in San Francisco that was filled with tech people's children. They called me and said, hey, can you fly to New Orleans and we'll just come, the whole class will come and meet you there. So they flew me to New Orleans to give them a tour of New Orleans and talk about Reconstruction, which I thought was kind of fun. All right. I wanted to open the floor. We got 15 minutes left. I wanted to open the floor for discussion. And if you guys have any questions, I want to extend also the same offer that was extended by Mr. Rudney. I do this every day, all day. I visit classes all the time. If you ever should need me to come to your class, if you're using the book, if you're not using the book, I'd be happy to Zoom in and visit and talk about Reconstruction.
Do you have a digital, is there a digital copy we could buy?
There is a digital copy. Contact Historic New Orleans Collection, and they actually have teacher aids that they've developed and stuff for the books. So
Historic
New Orleans Collection, we'll be going there today. We'll be going there today. And they were the publishers of the book, so.
Okay.
Any questions? AME. No questions? Where's St. James AME? We ought to take a streetcar ride and we can go visit St. James AME. It's just past Canal Street. So if we walk to Canal Street and we took a streetcar going up to going in the direction of Lake Pontchartrain, as soon as you pass the interstate, you get off, and the interstate's dividing line. It's Claiborne. It's on the right-hand side. So if you go down 2 blocks on the right-hand side, you run into St. James AME Church.
I just found it real interesting. Number one, about Henry Clay Warren.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, Ben.
You talk about Henry Clay Warren. Haven't we figured out we don't trust people with Henry Clay's name to make deals? And then yesterday, I found it fascinating when we were talking about making concessions to the Democrats, and
right.
then in the 1930s, Neville Chamberlain makes concessions to the Nazis. It's like we don't learn from history. We give people that aren't on our side what they want for nothing. Then you're going to wind up.
I think that's the part of history we can learn from, though, is that you have to give something. Like you can't, if you go into a group of people and you say, look, we're just gonna cut the line here and that's the end of it, like you end up with another war. So like, they've kind of learned that I'm not saying you give too much, but that's part of the whole idea of, I'm gonna say it this way, it's part of the issue we have in America today. The whole idea of this country is that we come together with different ideas and we compromise on some sort of middle line. And we hope that that middle line leads us to a better place in the future.
Right.
The problem is when you have two sides who aren't willing to give any compromise at all, then you end up with what we end up with.
Yeah.
With two sides that are literally yelling past each other.
Polarization is a huge problem in the United States in the past and even today. We often get fixed on notions of race. We often get fixed on notions of religion. And those are things that we haven't been able to compromise on or find common ground on. It's either black and white issues where we can find no gray. And in those situations, people didn't partition themselves. And those are also topics that are generally circular topics in arguments.
The weird thing is those are the topics that have the most nuance. And I say in terms of the gray area with how you deal with of course, the whole racial issue in this country, there should be more acceptance, but it's like those feelings
right.
that are rooted in all that have the most nuance. So those are the feelings that you can change. Those are the ideas that you can show someone that there is a difference.
Well,
and a lot of people just root themselves so hard.
I would argue that those are topics that actually have the least amount of.
I'm using the wrong word.
Yeah, I don't think it's nuance.
Not necessarily nuance, but where you could sway someone who's crazy, radical in some.
Yeah, generally people tie themselves to a belief, and those beliefs are formed throughout their lives. And so changing someone, particularly an adult's perspective on those things, is generally pretty difficult. So to tell someone who's been a fervent believer in some religion that their religion's wrong is pretty pointless because it's going to be a circular argument. The same thing with race. If race is a construct that was just made up, to convince someone that it doesn't exist, it's pretty difficult because it was just made up anyway. So people get polarized around these concepts that are really, really hard to argue around. Dunn saw this, and he realized a number of things. And there are couples, this is a really long graphic history, and it deals with a lot of complex issues that we haven't talked about. Dunn will invent something called the Bakery for the People. He models it after socialist Germany at the time, where there are collectives of people that pool their money together. And he tries to convince former slaves to give money because he said, we have no capital to build anything, but we'll be late. He says, what's the point of being a slave, enslaved, and then becoming a wage slave where you're working for low wages? He said, we have to start owning our own things. We have to start building bakeries. We have to start building everything that the white community has. And then it won't really matter that they don't want us to go to their stuff. If we have our own theater, and someone asked him about that, and that's where Roudnay and I would probably differ, because Roudnay, his family largely followed what went on in the French Revolution. And the French Revolution was all about dismantling all these barriers and creating equal access to every institution. Dunn didn't believe in that. Dunn said, why should I force myself into another man's parlor? And he said, if they don't want me in their theater, I'm going to build my own theater, and it'll be just as good as theirs and with better talent. And that was his mindset. But he realized the obstacle to that was capital. And he tried very hard to build capital, but it's hard to convince people who have never had money and never worked for wages that you have to give a portion of this to a collective to build a community's wealth. So, I mean, he was far beyond his time as a leader. That would be radical today. And it's the same thing that Marcus Garvey was saying, in the UNIA. We need to have collective wealth in order to build things, to build capital projects, and to build a community that has money that circulates within it. So I'm really just going back to the people who had enslaved us. Yeah.
Isn't that similar to Booker T. Washington as well? Like the view on race and how they should elevate them, how African Americans should elevate themselves versus like W.E.B. Du Bois and like I.W. Wells and like them were more like.
No, it's more Garvey. What Booker T. Washington espoused was a series of principles: thrift, work, industrial work, and home ownership were his biggest principles. But he wanted blacks to be laborers in an industrial system. And Du Bois warned against that. He's like, what if they stop being industrial for some reason? Which happened, right? And throughout the United States, industries started going elsewhere, and blacks found themselves what? Largely out of jobs. Du Bois's argument was blacks should aspire to whatever they can do at the highest level. He said, if you could be a doctor, why should I tell you to be a carpenter? You know, if you could be a professor, why should I tell you to be a plumber? You know, he's like, you should do whatever you do at the highest level. And he believed that only 5% of the black population had the ability to transcend at the highest level. But he said it was the responsibility of that, the 10th of the population. It's the responsibility of that 10th to what? Drag the other 90% kicking and screaming to progress, right? He's like, there's going to be people that are never going to be successful. He's like, but we can't wait on them. We got to, you know, do everything we can as the 10th to drag the rest of them forward.
Okay, so, I might be wrong, but, so what you're saying, so Dunn, if they didn't want him in their theater, he was going to build his own.
Yes.
So, didn't...
And there's a particular incidents that go into why he believed you shouldn't integrate everything. And I'll give you those principles.
Because it sounds like, didn't that contribute to segregation? Like, is that, like, huh?
Yeah.
Like...
I'll explain why he did that.
Okay.
Okay, we talked about his role in Freemasonry as being the highest ranking black Mason. There were white Masons in the city, and there was an integrated lodge that was formed called the Chastain Lodge. The Chastain Lodge was praised all over the world. Garibaldi wrote and praised them for founding this interracial lodge. But Dunn didn't like it. Why didn't Dunn like it? Because it was inside of these lodges and inside of these all-black churches that they were able to organize. They were able to fundraise. And he said, what's going to happen if we integrate our black institutions? He said, what's going to happen is white people are going to come in, they're going to make themselves the leaders of it, and we can't organize anything, and we can't raise any money for our causes in it anymore. He said they're going to take over our institutions like everything else they took over. So what we have to do is have certain institutions that are mutually beneficial and that are too expensive for us to build two separate ones. Can't build two separate school systems. We can't build two separate railroad systems. We can't build two separate, he said, those institutions are the institutions that we really have to focus on integrating. Those things that are paid for with common money, those things that are paid for. But he said these private institutions, they want to have a private club that's all white. It's their decision, you know. They want to integrate their club. That's their decision. But he was like, in these places where our leadership comes from, in these places where our money comes from, he said, we cannot trust they're going to do the right thing. It's kind of like Baldwin said. He said, you know, you tell me you're going to do something, you know, you tell me you're going to do the right thing, but I watch your actions every day. And he said, you know, we cannot afford to give up these institutions and then trust that the right thing will be done for our people.
Mom Ali said about the snakes.
Mm-hmm.
Mom Ali says if a bunch of snakes come in and they got that one good snake, you're supposed to trust that one good snake. Like,
yeah, I'm supposed to be able to pick that one good snake out of. So Dunn wasn't at all a racist. I mean, but he was a realist in regard to, he knew that this concept of race was something hard that was going to be difficult for us to get over. And he didn't see it as something that would happen in a single lifetime. He realized that it would be up to the children to dismantle the concept of race. And they would do this by the proximity and the relationships that they would form in institutions of education. Yeah. Yeah. The reason that resonated more with me is I was the first generation of my family to be able to go to integrated public schools. And like I said, my brother moved to a white flight community. So most of the people I went to school with were white. Most of them, I was the very first black person they knew.
My husband, he went to first grade. They didn't have kindergarten. When he went to first grade, that was the first time that he saw a black person. Mm-hmm. Was when he was in first grade. Like not at a store, and that was crazy to me. Like, now my husband is 12 years older than I am. Mm-hmm. So, we joked that he was graduating and I was finishing kindergarten, but, but he's older, so it just surprised me. Like, that was not part of my growing up. I had black people all around me all the time. Right. But for him to tell me that, I was like, are you serious? Like, I couldn't understand that concept. But then I started, well, wait a minute. Okay, so that's in the 60s. Right. So, but it did surprise me.
Now, for most of my classmates, I was really, especially, being one of the first people in Jefferson Parish and gifted and talented that was black in the, 70s, 80s, it was filled with kids of judges and lawyers and business owners. And
do you think that what Oscar Dunn did by making their own places and making a place for themselves, do you think that that's where the segregation came from? Do you think that it was already segregated?
No, it was already segregated. In fact, that whites were resisting. In fact, that's why a lot of whites liked Dunn so much. Because where Ruinez was saying, I want to be in your club, I want to go to your restaurant, I want to go, white people were like, no, we like Dunn more, because his idea is, you build your own stuff, we build ours, and we just share these things, and eventually our children will get along with it.
That's why I was trying.
I will say, I guess I get where you're coming from with your idea. I'll say that. So whenever I went to college, I went from I grew up in Mandeville, went from Mandeville to Baton Rouge, and I worked at Winn-Dixie. And one of the women I worked in the deli, and one of the women I worked with, she's an older black lady, and she straight up asked me the first week that I worked there, "Am I the first black woman you ever worked with?" And I said, "No." She's like, "Well, am I the first black person you've ever really talked to?" I said, "Well, no. I mean, I went in Mandeville. We have there's kids who
there are black people, yeah."
I was like, "There's black people everywhere." I don't really. But the crazy thing, honestly, after talking to her for a little while, I realized, okay, so this is a woman who grew up in Baton Rouge, who literally has never left she lived her entire life in Baton Rouge, has never left really for anything, except when she has left, she's only gone to all black communities and the places that she's gone to. For whatever reason, that's been her life. Okay. It is what it is.
And you guys are only thinking of this as a white phenomenon, like white people are encountering black people. But for black people, particularly there is it isn't that black people had never encountered whites. It's encountering them on equal footing. Yeah. If you're encountering someone and you're told that you're less than them and you have to treat them with deference all the time, that's not the same as going to class and this is my friend and we sit together and I sit with you and we can study together. That's entirely different. That had never existed. So for blacks, this is an experiment just as much as it was for whites. This is a huge challenge on both sides. And I just want you guys to understand that not all African Americans felt the same way. Not all African Americans were really, really pro-integration in the way that Ruinez was pro-integration. They had different concepts of what integration would look like, what it would feel like, and how it would empower communities.
When you said the lady extra that, I think I was telling Courtney them about it yesterday. I teach at it's not even predominantly black, it's an all black school. And I teach 6th and 7th grade social studies. And one of my 7th graders asked me last year, I was like, Miss Sanders, have you ever had a white teacher? And I was like, duh. Like, and I was like, I've never had a white teacher. And I was like, are you serious? It was literally, you know, when we grew up, it was, have you ever had a black teacher?
Have you ever?
And so for them, that was like, I've never had a white teacher. So when you was like, Baton Rouge,
What's like
either these kids in North Baton Rouge, never been anywhere but North, and I was like, y'all never had a white teacher? That, I didn't have my first white teacher. Well, I had a 4th grade.
One of the things that happened when they started busing in the 1970s, one of the things that was done in Boston that wasn't done here was that they switched leadership of schools. So what they did, it was placed in some white schools a black principal and assistant principal. And some schools that had been majority black, they placed a white principal. And they thought that that was really, really important, that kids begin to see different people in leadership, to understand that leadership wasn't about race as it was about talent and ability. And what's different in Louisiana is when they integrated schools, really black teachers disappeared entirely. Black male, particularly black male teachers, they disappeared entirely. They just didn't hire them. So
I worked in St. Martin Parish for 17 years as a teacher, and they are still under, like, they never met the desegregation order. So probably my last 4 years working there, they were closing down schools and busing those kids. Like, there's a separate community in St. Martin Parish, it's called Catahoula, that it was like the white flight community.
Right.
And they have their own little community, K-8 school, where all the white kids attended because they didn't want to send their kids to St. Martinville schools.
Right.
So those kids would then go to the senior high, or they would go to Broadridge High School, but they were not attending like the primary schools in St. Martinville.
right.
And even the diocese shut down like the Catholic school once this desegregation order was starting to be enforced, because and I don't know why they shut down that, but a lot of kids were like, a lot of the people, another white flight took place.
Right.
So I think this is where a lot of the draw for wanting to go to like the charter schools was starting to happen in that community.
One of the things that has worked negatively against us in the United States, and I'll draw this back to those who really loved history. There was a historian that became very famous. He was one of the early presidents of the American Historical Association, Frederick Jackson Turner, for what is called the Turner Thesis. And he said that the thing that made the United States great and powerful eventually is the size of the United States and the amount of resources therein. There was always room for expansion. But that room for expansion also made it easy for things not to change, because whenever you didn't like something, you could just move west and then you create your own little world, and then as the regular world reach you again, you just move west again. And that those concentric circles of expansion have been the things that have kept us separate. I mean, we've kept ourselves spatially separate, and in keeping ourselves spatially separate, we've kept ourselves culturally separate also. So it's really, really important to break down these boundaries in classrooms, particularly in public schools, to keep people together. You know, and people ask me all the time, spatially, if our country had been a smaller place, or if we hadn't been able to expand, what would have happened? And I said, well, we would have to figure out ways to work with one another. We couldn't just run away from our problems and run away from these issues and run away from these discomforts and build new suburbs every week or every few years. We'd have to sit and work things out. And we haven't been able to do that. And because of the size of our country, it's been easy enough for us to perpetually do this. One of the things when we look at the environmental effects of that, there have been enormous environmental effects. How many people have to commute for work? Okay. The average commute in the United States has grown tremendously over the years. And in the last school district, when I lived in Arkansas, the average commute there was 75 miles a day. And that comes with an added cost of gas. So you have gas. You have to look at the effects environmentally that all of those cars being on the road has played. For every mile of infrastructure of road we build, it costs millions of dollars to maintain that mile. So when I say that we've kept ourselves segregated, that has come at enormous cost to our nation. Enormous cost. So quite often we're looking for ways, we're supposed to be looking for ways to cut costs right now, but we're still willing to invest in practices which we know are going to fail in the end.
Well, no, what she was saying about because I didn't even think about it. What she was saying about like the separate community, I live in Baton Rouge, and I'm pretty sure y'all heard of St. George.
I have a cousin that lives there. I have a cousin that lives there.
They're trying to.
That's a new one.
No, they did it.
They did it.
They broke away, yeah.
Predominantly upper middle class white communities of Baton Rouge broke away from Baton Rouge at large, so they could siphon their tax dollars into their own schools.
They don't want to
cause
take
bigger
the
problems in Baton
school
Rouge.
that is their school. Like they
No,
don't
they
want
want-
to take.
They want to build a new school.
Which is their school,
Yeah.
which is a black school. That it's not a good school, but they don't want it in St. George. But that's y'all's. That is the area. That's
So
y'all's.
in
So
your
they want
community,
to make their own perimeter.
So do they send
They
their
want to
kids back
gerrymander their own.
Yeah, they all go like
They literally want to gerrymander their own school district.
Yeah, they all.
Well, I've got a question for you.
I just,
I've got a question for you guys collectively as a group. So when we look at Dunn as a leader, we look at the decisions that he makes. Was he a pragmatic leader? I mean, is he a wise leader? What sort of attributes do we think we can extract from Dunn and take to our classrooms? Like, what sort of things about Dunn would you teach your students?
His leadership, for sure.
Definitely his leadership.
He saw things as they were in the moment. He saw things as they need to be in the moment, and he saw things as they needed to move forward. So he was able to kind of assess his own, what he knew of his life, what he knew of what needs to happen. So the idea of kind of self-segregation in a sense. He wasn't really demanding full self-segregation or full separation. He just felt like there needed to be separation in, I'm gonna call like in cultural settings.
Okay.
Whereas in public setting and cultural, I guess I'm gonna say isolated cultural settings. So like you're saying, like you have a private theater, sure, you build your own, but when it came to true public things, there needs to be integration. It's
Right.
like that's the first step to integrating society is keeping a little bit of your own and giving up a little bit.
And he realized it was going to be a gradual process.
And like in your classroom, that's kind of the idea of exchanging ideas. Have your own idea, take a little bit from others.
I mean, you have this system that had been entrenched in people's hearts and minds for centuries at this point. I mean, it was not going to be something that just switched overnight. People literally went to war and died for this cause. So you're not going to like just...
And keep in mind, we talked about the prevailing idea of white supremacy, which was still out there.
People. They didn't,
Right.
they didn't want to believe a different way. I mean, obviously not everybody believed that way, that white abolitionists in the North didn't, but like the people that lived in the South, that's what they knew, and they were willing to die for it.
White people who lived in the South.
Right.
The white people.
I just say that he was wise enough to realize that wasn't going to change overnight. So he was trying to find a way to path forward while understanding what was in front of him, the challenge in front of him.
Yeah, and he was able to incorporate new ideas. Like that one example is the Bakery of the People. He's able to incorporate ideas that aren't even native to this land and see the benefit for particularly his community. And be able to realize if I can bring a system like that to the United States, this would enable us to amass wealth. Okay. Any other questions? You guys are fantastic. Okay. All right. Well, I will pass on the floor.